All right, everybody, Mr. Armke back with you for Net 125. Today we're going to get into Module 10, Basic Router Configuration. So we're going to look at how to implement initial settings on a router and a couple of end devices. So we're going to look at three separate sections: initial router settings, interfaces, and the default gateway. So initial router settings first. We're going to go ahead and set up the device name, set up privileged exec mode, user exec mode, remote, telnet, and SSH access, encrypt all of our plain text passwords, and provide legal notification. So we can see here on the right the graphic. To set the host name, we're going to use we're going to go into enable. We're going to type in config T to get to our global line, and then we'll set up our host name and password. Line console 0 to access the console. We'll set our password. Make sure you set the login sequence to make sure it forces the login process. For the VTY lines, you don't have to do 0 through 4 and then 5 through 15. You can just do 0 through 15. Again, you want to make sure that you specify login. If you create a local user, you're going to need to create login local instead of just login. And you're also going to want to set your transport input type. Do you want to use SSH or Telnet? Unless you have a very pressing reason to do so, I always recommend SSH. And then service password encryption, banner MOTD. The pound signs here are what they call delimiters. There's a number of different characters you could use, but pound is just the easiest one to use. And then we type in end to go back to standard privileged exec, and then we'll do copy running config to startup config, or cop rust. Here we see the configuration there written a little bit differently. Once we have that configured up, we'll then go ahead and save that to NVRAM, and then we can reload, and all of the changes we just made will be kept. Now let's talk interfaces. Configuring a router interface includes the following commands. We need to know the interface, including its type and number. So if it's a fast Ethernet 0, we need to put in fast Ethernet 0, or 1, or 2, or 24, whatever we have. Description, we're going to use usually the abbreviation DESC, and then our text. If we're doing an IPv4 address, we need IP address, remember the space, and then we're going to go ahead and put in our subnet mask at the end. And we will type that out in dotted decimal, the same as the standard IPv4 address. IPv6 can be written in compressed form, so no leading zeros and the double colons if we're using them. And then we can put a slash for the CIDR, the prefix length for the slash notation. Usually it's going to be /64. Pretty much all of them are. And then, of course, no shutdown or no shut. The reason we want to emphasize this is because if we do not do this, the administratively down version of the interface will be kept. So it will stay down as it traditionally is. So here we can see an example for G000 on router 1. So we can see interface gigabit 000, description link to LAN. We've got our IP address with a 24-bit subnet mask, 255.255.255.0. Our IPv6 address, 2001 DB8 ACAD 10:1/64, and then no shutdown. Now, once we enter this and hit exit, you'll see that the config system goes ahead and kicks up. Hey, we're going to turn the Ethernet interface down. We're going to apply the settings and then set it back up. So even if it was already in the down state, it will set it down and then back up. If it was in an up state, it'll set it down and then back up. It has to reinitialize. And then we see also that the line protocol as well as the state will change. So not just the link, but the protocol. And then here we see the G001. So we see a little bit of difference here. We changed the description. Obviously, it has a different IP address and an IPv6 address. To verify our configuration, we're going to use show IP interface brief and show IPv6 interface brief. So the top one is IPv4. We can see that they're configured correctly. We can see our IP addresses. We see that they're both set in up status, whereas our VLAN is down because we didn't work with it. Then IPv6, we see the same thing. It's just abbreviated a little bit differently because of the addresses being longer. So here's just a summary of the commands that we use to verify. Check all our interfaces. So we see that IP and IP interface brief for version 4 and version 6. We see that for route, we see that for interfaces. And then show interfaces only shows IPv4. So if you want to do show interfaces and you want the IPv6 information, you have to make sure that you specify IPv6. So here we can see the show interface continued there. We can see the variations that are between 4 and 6. And here we can see the show route table. So if we know how the routing is done, when you get into Net 126, we'll talk about how to do what are called static routes. So we can automatically direct traffic that way regardless of the automatic configuration. And then here we see statistics for all interfaces, again IPv4 only with the show interfaces command. And you can see that it's significantly more detailed than what we would see on the show IPv4 interface setting. So it'll show you your queuing strategy, your duplex settings, what the media type is for your cable, what the encapsulation type is, all that good jazz. So there's a ton of information on show interfaces. Not all of it you will need. And here we can see the show IP interface command for a specific entry. A lot of the same information we saw on the previous list, it's just spaced a little bit differently. There's a different pagination for it. The lines are broken up a little differently. So here we see IPv6, so that gives us a lot of message as well. So we can see here that we're up. We can see our link local address. We can see our description, global unicast. Our group addresses for multicasting, our MTU, ICMP setup, whether we've got neighbor detection, we've got our data temp set, our millisecond interval for reachable time, blah, blah, blah. Now let's take a look at the default gateway, our way out of our local network. So the default gateway is used whenever a packet sends out of the network locally. The host will go from local to remote. The default gateway address is generally the router interface attached to the local network of the host. In this case, PC1 is on the same network as PC2, PC3 is on the same network as PC4. They are both connected to paired switches, and those switches are connected to a router. So the router has a 000 interface and a 001 interface. This allows the two of them to be considered outside of one another's range as far as local networks are concerned. If they were all connected to the first switch, then yeah, they'd be local, but because they're on opposite sides of the router interface, they are considered separated. So to reach PC3, as shown in the graphic, PC1 addresses a packet to PC3's IPv4 address, but it has to forward it through the router interface, G000 and G001. So that means that the MAC address that it's going to be delivered to is the G000 interface of R1, which will then pass it through to its external interface and pass it to PC3. A switch has to have a default gateway address to be remotely managed. If we use what's just called an unmanaged switch, we just plug it in, it will not be able to be remotely managed. To set up a default gateway on a switch, we have to use IP default-gateway and then declare the IP address in global config mode. We don't have to declare a mask. Obviously, the IP address itself will declare its mask. And here are our terms for Module 10. So we've got our show interfaces, show IPv6 interface, show IP interface, the brief versions as well, the default gateway, and routing. And that is Module 10, getting our general configuration for our interfaces and default gateway, etc. So if you have any concerns or questions beyond that, of course, I'm always glad to hear from you at jearmke063@cfcc.edu or my Google Voice number 239-7814. Thanks so much for your time and attention, guys. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you next class.